Meeting is a trade war with the
full-blown trade war. Trump is taking his global trade war.
Week, President Trump's trade war has stopped.
Every war leaves behind ruins, but a trade war leaves scars on your wallet, jobs, and entire economies. Think about it. The price of your phone, your car, even your groceries. All of these can be influenced by decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington or Beijing. Today, we will trace the journey of trade wars, from their messy history to the US-China clash that shocked the world, and finally, where this battle could take us in the future. And with no further ado, welcome to Conclude. Imagine a world where power wasn't measured in missiles or megabytes, but in ships filled with spices, silk, and silver. The 16th and 17th centuries were dominated by a single belief: wealth was finite. If one nation grew rich, it had to be at the cost of another. This idea, mercantilism, turned trade into a battlefield and ports into fortress of power. In 1651, Britain introduced the Navigation Act, a law that forced its colonies to trade only with English ships. It sounds bureaucratic, but it was a shackle. Colonists in America were forced to buy expensive Britain goods and sell raw materials at unfair prices. It was not just commerce, it was economic servitude. This created an undercurrent of anger. A farmer in Virginia watched his tobacco profit swallowed by unfair rules, unknowingly carrying the seed of revolution. This law planted the idea that economic control could enslave entire peoples. Now let's shift to China. In the 19th century, a civilization that saw itself as the center of the world, the British, desperate to balance trade deficit from importing Chinese tea and silk, found a sinister solution: opium. By 1839, millions of Chinese citizens were addicted. When the Qing dynasty tried to resist, Britain didn't back down with negotiations. It sent warships. The Opium War wasn't just about drugs, it was about forcing open market, breaking sovereignty, and proving that in the age of empire, gun followed trade. The humiliation left China frustrated, its port pried open and its people struggling with addiction. The trade here wasn't prosperity, it was poison. Fast forward to the 20th century, the world was reeling from the Great Depression, unemployment soaring, economies collapsing. In desperation, the US passed the Smooth Hollow Tariff Act of 1930, raising tariffs on more than 2,000 imported goods. The goal was to protect American farmers and its industries, but instead, the world retaliated. Canada struck back with its own tariff. Europe closed its doors. What followed was an economic chain reaction. Globe trade shrunk by 65% between 1929 to 1934. Imagine factories shut down, farmers with piles of unsold wheat, ships that once carried goods now resting in ports. What meant to save jobs ended up deepening misery worldwide. Economists still call it one of the most disastrous economic policy in the modern history. From colonial law to opium addiction to depression-era tariffs, these movements weren't just numbered in history books, they were real-life disruptions. Farmers lose land, workers lose jobs, and families lose hope. Trade war in this early form weren't fought with bomb, but with law, tariff, and ships. And just like war of blood, they left scars that last generations. The world changed after World War II. Bombed out cities, rebuilt, nations forged new allies, and leaders finally realized protectionism had nearly destroyed the world economy once before. So they built a new framework, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, GATT, in 1947, later transformed into the World Trade Organization in 1995. The vision, a boundaryless marketplace where goods flow freely and trade disputes were not settled by battleship but by negotiation. For decades, globalization filled billions out of poverty and reshaped the world. But underneath the surface, cracks began to appear. Picture the 1980s Japan cars, cheaper, smaller, and more fuel efficient, flood American highways. Brands like Toyota and Honda quickly became household names. Detroit, once the proud heart of American auto industry, suddenly found itself struggling. Unemployment rose in Michigan, factories shut down, and resentment grew. In response, the US pressured Japan into a deal. Voluntary export restraint. Japan agreed to limit car export, but the move wasn't just about economies. It was about pride. For Americans, it felt like reclaiming control. For Japan, it was a lesson in how global success can trigger political backlash. Then came NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994. It promised a new era of prosperity. Goods, services, and investments could now flow freely between the USA, Canada, and Mexico. But while corporations celebrated, workers felt betrayed. American factories' jobs migrated south to Mexico, where labor were cheaper. A steel worker in Pittsburgh suddenly found his plant closed. While a factory sprouted across the border, NAFTA became a symbol of globalization's double-edged sword. Profits rose, but so did inequality. And then came the giant China. In 2001, China joined the WTO, and the world welcomed it as a new manufacturing hub. What followed was unprecedented. Chinese factories churned out electronics, toys, manufacturing at lightning speed, and with rock-bottom prices. By 2010, China had overtaken Japan as the world's second largest economy. But in the US, the story was darker. A study in MIT economists later revealed that came to known as China shock. Between 1999 and 2011, the surge of Chinese import cost America 2.4 million manufacturing jobs. Entire towns in Ohio, Michigan, and Peninsula, once built around steel and textile, now hollowed out. For many Americans, globalization no longer meant opportunity, it meant unemployment, and this grievance would later fuel a political movement that demanded confrontation, not cooperation. The late 20th and early 21st century was supposed to be a golden age of free trade, but instead they exposed deeper contradictions. Cheaper goods but broken community, expanding wealth but rising inequality, global growth but national anger. Factories in Detroit closed, farmers in Mexico struggled with subsidized US corn, Chinese workers labored 14 hours a day for the world's biggest brands. Trade war was no longer about colonies or opium, they were about who win and who lose in a globalized economy. The year was 2018. Washington decided it had enough. President Donald Trump accused China of unfair trade practices, from intellectual property theft to currency manipulation, and slammed tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Beijing didn't blink. Within hours, it retaliated with equal force, targeting American soybeans, cars, and whiskey. What began as a dispute became a full-blown trade war, shaking the foundation of the global economy. The consequences were immediate. US soybean export to China, once worth of $12 billion annually, collapsed by 75% in 2018. American farmers were left pillows of overflowing unsold crops, despite of government bailouts. Meanwhile, global supply chains snapped. Companies like Apple, whose iPhone relied on Chinese assembly, were caught in the crossfire. American consumers paid the price too. Tariff quietly added hundreds of dollars to household expense each year. But the ripple effect didn't stop at America's borders. Global GDP was slowed by 0.3% annually, according to IFM. Multinationals scrambled to diversify, like Apple, shifted 7% of iPhone assembly to India, while Vietnam exports to the US skyrocketed by double digits. The phrase friendshoring entered boardrooms as companies sought political safety supply chain even if it meant higher costs. The world had entered a new phase of geopolitics where trade was no longer about economics alone. It was about security, alliance, and leverage. Trump later extended tariff to Europe, Canada, and even India. Analysts call this approach tariff by tweet because global market could swing widely with a single message from the White House. The UN confessed on trade and development warning that unprecedentedly itself and become the UN Conference on Trade and Development warned that unpredictability itself and became the biggest risk to global trade. Ships were rerouted, contracts renegotiated, and foreign investment froze. Trade war was no longer isolated battles. They had become a permanent state of economic uncertainty. History teaches that trade war rarely produced winners, and yet here we are again, with the world's two largest economies locked in a cycle of tariffs, retaliation, and political theater. Experts warn that tariffs may spread into new industries. Trump had hinted at 100% tariff on India and Chinese imports, while also targeting critical sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceutical. It pushed rate could rise as high as 250%. For India, this is no small threat. Its own chief economic advisor estimated that tariff as high as 50% could shave 0.5% of GDP growth. Just as smooth holiday in the 1930s led to devastation, the current trade war is nudging countries toward new strategies. Diversification of supply chains. Vietnam, Mexico, and India are gaining as China alternatives. Regional trade blocs, the EU, ASEAN, and RCEP, are quickly tightening ties, reducing reliance on the US and China. With the US Supreme Court reviewing whether Trump's tariff powers are even lawful, the trade war could force reversal, unwinding deals, and refunding billions in tariff revenues. If protectionism persists, we could see the world splitting into competing economic blocs, a US-led system versus a China-centered one. This isn't just about goods, it's about technology, AI, and even rare earth minerals. Economists warn that global trade could shrink by up to 20% in a full-scale discoupling scenario. The result? Higher prices for consumer, fragile financial conditions, and the erosion of trust in global institutions like the WTO. And here's the haunting parallel. In the 1930s, smooth holiday helps push the world deeper into depression and political instability. Some historians even urge it paved the road for extremist movements and global conflict. Today we face a similar crossfire. Will trade war remain a tool for short-term leverage, or will they spiral into something that reshapes the global order itself? Economists like David Goldwyn called Trump's policy deeply hypocritical, pointing to selective enforcement against India versus leniency toward China. The UN warns that unpredictability in US trade policy has become a major source of instability. Global container volume to North America are already falling. US holiday shipments of toys, furniture, and electronics are dropping sharply. And countries like India, Vietnam, and Mexico are left navigating a world where a single tweet can upend billions in trade. Most experts agree this isn't a strategy, it's a gamble, and the cost of gamble is being paid not just in Washington or Beijing, but in every household that sees price rise, every factory's worker who loses a job and every farmer whose harvest sits unsold. Trade war may begin as bargain chip, but history shows they almost always end as global burdens. And thank you for watching. See you in the next one.